Hi guys. Cool. I am excited to look at some of these questions. I think they're good ones. This is maybe a funny game to have tried to do these like end of segment questions in, because I feel like I got a little bit lost in the woods on that second one, and the game itself is bringing up a lot of the things that I wanted to talk about in pretty explicit terms. So I think we're going to get some good Q&A questions. I'm going to start at the top. Do you think that the way save states are narratively integrated was a conscious attempt at introducing new players to the concept of save states? Because that seems pretty efficient to me. That's an interesting way of framing it. Introducing new players to the concept of save states. Because they're not ever referred to as save states, right? This sort of like power to go back in time is... I'm trying to think about how it works non-linearly. Because it's presented, that interface presents it as like a graph progressing forward from one thing to another. And is that just if I go into the woods and then come back out of the woods and then go into the woods, is it going to create multiple save states and add them to that chain? I think it actually might. That's not how I interpreted it at first. So those are literally like it has a, or however it works, it's got some kind of a checkpointing system, right? Because I'm not explicitly saving the game. And this is some kind of an interface to that checkpointing system. That's a good question. Because there is kind of a question of like, who is this game for? Is this a game for people who have zero experience with games? That seems unlikely, because it's drawing so heavily on established tropes, and not just tropes, but like literally phrasings. I would use the word phrasings generally to refer to not just like the words "it's dangerous to go alone," but also the specific costuming. Like that green hat is iconic. Like those kinds of things are some that like a brand new gamer is not going to get that, right? So there seems to be a lot of effort put into creating references for established gamers who would be familiar with save states. But maybe that's there's sort of an element of trying to make it broader. I think more what it's trying to do is explain narratively why the save system is pervasive in the way that it is. Because, I mean, it's one thing to just have sort of like a checkpointing system, but in this game, first of all, that checkpointing system existing and working in a particular way is vitally important. Because as we saw, when I literally crashed the game, it is pretty easy. Like the game gives the player enough power to literally crash it. And a player who is experimenting, which is what players do, right? Typically a player is going to come into this without the knowledge to just interact expertly with the system. They're going to tinker. They're going to experiment with the system in order to try to figure out like what it is that they can do. And in the course of that experimentation, by its very nature, they're going to stumble onto combinations of variables that crash the game. So having a checkpointing system that allows for that allows you to sort of like take back a few moves and not be punished for it, is super important for this game. I honestly think that the purpose of sort of making it like a medallion and integrating it narratively is to draw attention to it for the player, so that the player cannot sort of misunderstand the way that this game is saving and the way that they can interact with loading previous states, because that become such an important part of the game. And there's sort of 3 sections to this game. In the 3rd section, I think it involves actually writing code, and then it becomes like super easy to just destroy everything. And so you need to have that kind of backup system. How do you feel this game has done with providing multiple solutions to puzzles? One good example, thank you, Thanarad, is while you solved the Swamp King obstacle, while I did manage to solve that, the turtles had a faction variable you could have switched to good. Maybe made the turtles charge the Swamp King without your body in the way. Do you feel like everything you solved had potentially multiple solutions? That I appreciate you asking a question at the end of that instead of just simply pointing out how I did that the hard way. Because I definitely did that the hard way. I wasn't paying attention. I was looking at all of the other variables. I had a solution sort of in mind, and I completely missed or didn't think about the significance of the fact that they had a faction. That would have made things so much easier. Just like set them to explode, change their faction, get out of the way. Like that was the simple solution to that puzzle. I didn't have to do any of the dodging and dying and messing around with idle states. I say idle states. Those are really what I've been referring to as idle states for some reason is the state machine, right? That's a representation as a loop of the state machine that the AI is running on. We talked back in Papo.io, we talked a lot about the state machine that underlies the AI of a non-player character. And so this game is just like really, really brutally exposing that logic. But the actual question, do you feel like everything you've solved has potentially had multiple solutions? Yeah, to some extent, to a greater or lesser extent, I think that's 100% true. And I think that's sort of by the nature of the fact that all of these puzzles are sort of programming based. The game has a pretty good ramp. Like it starts me off, messing around with bushes, and there's not a lot that I can do with bushes, and then there's not a ton that I can do with turtles, but I can do quite a bit with like turtle spawners and turtles in combination, and then I can do like even more with other things. Then the evil turtles have like a lot of states that I can mess around with, or a lot of variables that I can mess around with. So that ramping is really good, but you very quickly reach a point where you're handing the player a lot of power. And that power can be sort of not abused, but sort of used mistakenly, I guess, in ways that crash the game, and we saw that. And so that's something that the game obviously has to address. But it can also be used more maliciously. I mean, this is sort of very close to an introduction to what hacking is, at least conceptually, is taking a system that is complicated enough that it has to expose a certain amount of control to an outside user, and then exploiting the control that it gives you to do something potentially unexpected. And so we're like, a lot of what we've seen has still been very relatively simple, and kind of like able to be mentally modeled by the designers and contained in a decent way. But we're really we're entering territory where the designer has to come to terms with the fact that they're not going to be able to predict the emergent behavior that players exhibit when they have that kind of control. And so everything has multiple solutions just because you have there's so much that you can do once you expose those variables, enough of those variables, that it's hard to design puzzles that don't have multiple solutions, honestly. Like, the more power you give to the player, this is, in some ways I would relate this, honestly, just because I said the word emergent, I'm going to relate this to sort of more open worldy games. Every time I say emergent, and I say it a lot, I think about a talk that I saw Warren Spector give at a Sandbox conference. That was one of my favorite conferences I've ever gone to, and doesn't really exist anymore. Warren Spector gave a talk about Deus Ex, and one of the emergent behaviors in Deus Ex is that you can attach mines to walls, and I think they're like, they must not be proximity mines. Maybe they're triggered mines, but sort of in a James Bond GoldenEye fashion, you can attach them to walls and then like explode them when enemies come around the corner or something like that. But they're modeled. They have hitboxes. They're very small, but they're physical objects. And when you attach one to a wall, if you jump just right, you can actually like stand on the lip of the mine. The simulation, the physics simulation will allow that, and so people started climbing impossible to climb walls that were supposed to be way too high for anybody to ever scale, by attaching mines in like staircase fashion, and then climbing up them, and getting into parts of the game, like unloaded parts of the level and other stuff like that, which he was using this to illustrate the idea of when you give the player power. In this case, it's the power to sort of manipulate the physical objects in the world, which today we take for granted. I mean, like, there are a lot of games that give players that power, but Deus Ex was one of the first to sort of give the player power to that extent. And so that's the sort of thing that the designer did not predict and never saw come out in playtesting, because playtesting is sort of by necessity fairly limited. You get a good sense of how you're hitting experience design goals, but you don't get a good sense of everything that players can potentially do once they start messing around with your game. It's the same principle. This is not an open world game in the sense that like they're giving us physics objects and allowing us to manipulate the physical simulation, but they're giving us, frankly, more power than that. They're giving us the power to manipulate other parts of the simulation, the AI, most notably, and that can sort of have the same effects. So yeah, I think there's sort of a preemptive designing puzzles to be solved multiple ways, because players are going to figure out multiple ways to solve them anyway. That went off on a tangent. Follow up: how important do you feel it is to have multiple solutions to problems in this kind of game? I think I addressed that like it's not just important; it's sort of inevitable. Okay. What have you learned from the game so far? Knowing that it is about programming makes it seem like it's trying to teach you features of object-oriented programming. Do you think you would actually be gaining understanding of that if you didn't already have it? That's such a great question. Oh my God. So the first part of that, like literally, what have we learned? That was my prepared question for the end of the last segment that I skipped over. So I'm glad that it got asked, and we'll think about that now. But the second half of this question is really, really, really good. Do you think you would actually be gaining understanding if you didn't already have it? That's hard. That's really hard. And it's almost unfortunate that I actually have two levels of understanding of this game. Because I know a lot about programming, and so the thing that it's trying to teach me I already know. And I also know kind of too much about the game because of the GDC talk that I saw, which I'm glad that I saw. It was really interesting, and it made me interested in the game, and I don't know that I would be playing it if I hadn't seen that talk. But I do feel like I'm absolutely getting a different experience now because I'm anticipating the things that the game is going to throw at me and how they're going to work, because some of that has been explained to me. So I think those two things kind of cancel each other out a little bit. Right now, I'm feeling... I don't feel like I'm gaining understanding in the way that I would expect to from a really solid educational game, but I think that's because my experience is mitigated by the fact that I know more about the game than I'm supposed to. If I didn't have an intuitive understanding, and I say intuitive, if I didn't have a preconceived understanding of some of the mechanics and the capabilities and how these puzzles are designed, then I think that I would be going through more of the learning process, right? I would have to experiment more with the mechanics that they give me, with those interfaces for manipulating variables, for seeing the underlying model, the simulated model of the world. I think that the game does a great job. The key thing that it needs to do to promote education is to fundamentally tie my progress in the game with my understanding of the concepts that it's trying to teach me. And I think it does a good job of that. I in each of these puzzles, I can't progress unless I sort of understand what it is that I'm doing. It's not enough to just randomly change variables. After the first couple of puzzles, when we have more than 2 variable fields in an object, randomly changing those numbers is just there's too many possible combinations, and I'm not, without some kind of a solid understanding of what I'm doing, some kind of a plan, I'm not going to see success with that strategy. Now, one of the problems potentially is that I'm actually I'm too good at this because I have too much of an understanding. I'm definitely not the audience for this game, in that I already have the knowledge that it is designed to convey. So I'm not making the same kinds of mistakes that somebody who's learning this for the first time would make. And those mistakes are illustrative, right? In games especially, the way that you learn is by making a mistake, by interacting with the system and having it not do the thing that you expected it to do, but having it give you enough feedback that you get a better understanding of the system through that interaction. And I think this game actually is set up really well from that perspective. It does that. It's just that I'm failing to interact with it in quite the way that would maximize, or certainly maximize, the visibility of that process taking place. Did any of that make sense? I hope so. Great question, though. So what have we actually learned? I mean, I feel yes, there's an object-oriented model that it's teaching me. That is one thing. So the fact that each object has, each character and sort of interactable object in the world has its own set of variables that can be manipulated independently. That is, that's part of the procedural rhetoric, honestly, of the game. And I'm not going to get into that now, but next time, that is 100% going to be one of my topics for discussion. So there is it's teaching us fundamentally about a basic object-oriented approach to programming. I think more the thing that it's doing, I saw somebody in the chat sort of phrase it this way earlier. This is less a game about skill building. It's not teaching me how to program, certainly not yet, but it is teaching me to have a mindset. It's teaching me an understanding. It's helping me understand how games are constructed from a programming perspective in a way that I might not have had before. So not just this object-oriented approach to programming, but the idea that each object in the game has lots of potential behaviors, and those potential behaviors can be adjusted, and adjusting them gives you a different experience of the game. Like, if you can flip enemies from, or if you can flip characters from bad faction to good faction, then that dramatically changes how the scene plays out. And that is a pretty straightforward leap to make. Like, that's the first thing that it teaches me. And then the second step in teaching me the same basic understanding of like deconstructing how a game works is to show this underlying model of the simulation that the game is using to run. Like, what is the game's understanding of the world, right? And that's a thing that I think we've talked about before too, although I don't remember in what context. So me as a player having an understanding of what the game's understanding of the world is sort of, in some games, vitally important. In other games, the design of the experience will try to minimize that difference, so that the game seems to be high fidelity, right? It seems to react the way that I would expect it to. This game illustrates really well how you frequently take shortcuts in order to achieve that fidelity. And you rely on the fact that players have an extremely incomplete understanding of what the underlying simulation is, and that players are, that human beings tend to try to make sense of the things that happen. So I'm thinking specifically of the vision cones that guards have. If I can't see those vision cones, then basically what I'm going to know is that when I get too close to a guard and the guard is facing me, then he starts chasing me. And that seems totally natural to me, right? That seems like a high fidelity simulation, because that's what I would expect to happen. If like I'm trying to sneak around and I get too close to somebody and they're facing me, then they're gonna see me and my sneaking around has failed. Now obviously there's some like the size of that cone, like the distance that you can get to something, I would recognize that pretty quickly as a limitation of the game, and work around it. But the fact that it's kind of fuzzy, I know approximately how close I can get without triggering a guard, but I don't know exactly how close I can get, creates this sort of sense that the simulation of the guard's ability to see me is better than it actually is. I'm not big into speedrunning. But some of you might be more into speedrunning than me. And this is the kind of thing that speedrunners who use, glitching, take advantage of. That they have developed or have researched a complete understanding of the underlying model that the game is running on, that a normal player just doesn't have. And they can use, that's exactly what we're doing here, right? The second part, what we've done so far, all of this sneaking around guards, is literally, it's teaching us how to glitch a game. It's teaching us that if we have a complete enough understanding of the underlying model, then we can exploit it. We can sort of, get right up next to the collision box of the guard. As long as we don't go over it, the computer simulation is not going to recognize that as being too close to a guard. And so we can do things that, don't really make a lot of sense. That don't make a lot of sense, like when you think about the game as a narrative extrapolation, when you think about it as like something that is modeling the real world, because that model is extremely simplified, as it is in any game. Okay, maybe one more question. Okay. Do you think this is a game primarily aimed at game designers? There's a certain delightfulness in seeing behind the curtain, hitboxes, and so on, but in some ways only if you know what you're looking at. This is... Okay, so that's a great question. I don't know how much it comes across. I imagine that it comes across pretty well. A big thing that I get out of a sense that I get out of this game is that it was rushed. It did not have all of the time that it wanted to be everything that it could have been. And I see... I could be wrong, actually, now that I'm thinking about it, because I see that in sort of how the controls don't feel really tight, and some of the interactions that I have just don't feel... They feel very loose. That's the word that I'm going to use. Actually, now that I think about it, that looseness is kind of inherent to the type of game that it is. The fact that like they've simplified the underlying model to the point where a player should be able to understand it, and then they visualize it for you so that you can understand it. You could have a higher fidelity model, and most games would, but it would be harder to understand. And so this game can't do that. So actually, I take that back. I still think the dialogue feels a little rushed. Like it could have used some more editing. I still kind of get that sense, but whatever. It's not in the place where I thought I was sort of. That's not where I was going. I don't think that this is a game that was intended to be aimed primarily at game designers. This is where I'm going. And it's hard for me to judge because of what we talked about, where, I have too much knowledge going into this to have sort of the intended experience for a novice player, for a naive player. I believe my reading of this is that this is a game that is meant to teach people who don't know much about game design some things about how game production actually happens, how games are put together. I think that by its nature, anyone who is already an expert in that is going to find it charming in a way, because it is speaking to their expertise. I think the intention is to actually teach people about those systems. So, seeing hitboxes is supposed to teach me about the way that games model interactions and use hitboxes to do that. And the fact that I already know what hitboxes are and how they work and just take it for granted kind of works against me developing that understanding. So I actually don't know that this is a really good representative playthrough of how the game works on an educational level for non-designers. I think we're kind of only seeing it a little bit through the lens of a designer playing it. Now I don't know, and so the other thing, the corollary to this is that I don't know if it's 100% successful. And I feel like it's I want, as a game designer, looking at this experience and just kind of my gut reaction, I think it needs a little bit more explanation. I think it needs a little bit more hand-holding in the concepts. That's not a great place for me to go. I mean, like, really a good educational game, you don't want to over-explain the concepts, you just want to let the player interact with them. This game, I think, is doing all of that exactly right, and yet I still feel like your average naive player would have a hard time. Well, I don't know. Maybe your average naive player is actually somebody who's pretty familiar with games, who's played Link to the Past, who's just never made a game before. And so they have an intuitive understanding of some of this underlying model, right? If you've played Link to the Past, you get how guards work. You just maybe have never visualized exactly what their hitbox structure looks like. And so this game is literalizing that. So maybe that's who it's really for, and maybe it is really effective for those people. It's hard for me to say. I think it's interesting, and maybe it's notable, and maybe it's relevant, that this game received a lot of acclaim from game designers. And I think it received much more mixed reviews from the gaming public. It won awards, but the awards that it won were sort of, awards that were put together and granted by people who make games, and so, or at least people who have an expert understanding of the concepts that this game is teaching. So, maybe it's significant that those are the people who thought this was a really clever educational game, and the people who didn't have that understanding going into it, who the game is ostensibly really for, found it sort of less successful. I don't know. But there was some discussion in the chat about how rushed the game actually was, and I don't know the answer to that. And I agree I admit that maybe it's not actually, some of the things that I thought felt rushed might actually be features. But it was a cheap game. I know that it was an extremely low budget game, which means rushed. That's the synonymous. So it was not they didn't have all of the time in the world. They might have had enough time to do what they wanted to do. But it was definitely, this was a very, very cheap game. I think just because partially that's how Double Fine has to roll these days, and partially because it's unclear whether there was an audience for it, and it's still kind of unclear to me whether there's an audience for it. The answer seems to be maybe no, but I don't want to believe that. So, okay, there were other questions, and there are some good questions, but it's getting late. So I'm going to stop there. So if you have questions that you want to still ask, save them for next week. We'll do Q&A again, or post them in the forum, or hit me up on Twitter. Links to both of those things are down below this video on the Twitch page or the YouTube page. Before I go, just real quick, Play by Play Network is great and growing, and I can't even keep track of it all anymore. Cage Tiger is still hosting her stream, but I don't know that it's still on Saturdays. So I hang out on the forum. I think there will probably be announcements on the forum for exactly how that shakes out. Bill is, I think, still doing Sundays at 6 o'clock. Fun with Bill and Maria. Definitely check that out. That tends to be a lot of fun. And then after that, Sunday Game Club is still going on. but I've missed the last couple, so I don't know if they're still playing Kingdom Hearts. Cage Tiger thinks that she's still going to be Saturdays, but maybe at 7 instead of 8. Yeah, so this is terrible. I'm supposed to be just like going down. So Cage Tiger, Fun with Bill and Maria, Sunday Game Club with Thanarod. Feedback Force is now recording, I think, on Sundays. So there was not a new podcast yesterday, but there will be one later this week. Check out the forum. The forum is the place to go to find more up-to-date information on all of these things. Follow me on Twitter if you want sort of week-by-week updates of like what's going on. That's it. That was a disaster. I'm done. Still haven't done the TIS 100 stream. Will do that at some point because I really want to play that game. Maybe after we finish this one. It's going to be really interesting to contrast that with Hack and Slash. They're both games that are about programming, that require you to program, and I think to learn something about programming. But they take very different approaches, and they teach different things in different ways. There's some interesting discussion to have around that. Okay, I'm done. That's it. I'm going. I will see you guys next week. We will continue playing Hack and Slash. I look forward to it. Thank you for joining me. My name is Sean Bouchard. This has been Play by Play. Have a great night.